Mystery of the Golden Horn by Phyllis Whitney. 1. The Broken Pieces. Vicky Stewart sat huddled in the darkness at the turn of the stairway. Her pajama-clad knees were pulled up to her chin, her hands clasped tensely around them. Brown hair, short and curly at the temples, was tousled since she had left her bed for this eavesdropping, and her dark brows were drawn into a scowl as she strained to listen. Downstairs in the living room, the four aunts were holding what they called a council of war. They were talking about her, and Vicky knew if she listened long enough, she would undoubtedly hear some very unpleasant things. When they turned unpleasant enough, she would run softly downstairs in her bare feet and burst dramatically in upon them. She would glare at them all and make her announcement loudly and firmly. "No," she would cry, "I will not be sent off to Istanbul. I won't go to Turkey, and you can't make me." Her heart thumped as she imagined their reaction. She was so warm with anger, so trembly with anticipation, that she could hardly hear what was being said. Yet she must hear in order to understand the plans that were being made for her. There, that was Aunt Laura speaking. She was the oldest of the three who were her mother's older sisters, and she was the one Vicky liked the least. "Thank goodness Alan has come to his senses and is willing to take her," Aunt Laura boomed. "Let me have his letter, May, if you've read it. He says we can send her to Istanbul as soon as she has her passport and all the right shots." "It's the only solution, of course," Aunt Connie said. "We have planned our round-the-world tour for months, and we can't cancel it at the last minute because of this accident, unhappy as we feel about it." The accident had been a dreadful fall down the basement stairs by Vicky's mother. It had sent her to the hospital with a damaged back and brought on the whole crisis. As Vicky knew very well, no one felt worse about this than Mother. "Of course, we can't cancel the trip," Aunt Gertrude echoed. She was the one who always agreed with Laura and Constance. The rustle of paper told the listener on the stairs that her father's letter was being passed from aunt to aunt. Vicky had to blink to keep back the furious tears. If she meant to confound and defy the aunts, it would never do to start weeping out of sheer rage. She would not go to Turkey. This was only April. There were 2 months left of the spring term. Margie's birthday party was coming up next month, and there were other events she didn't want to miss. When school ended, she would go off to Camp Glenwood with the other girls as usual. A voice much gentler than Aunt Laura's, and not nearly so firm, was speaking, and Vicky listened again. That was Aunt May, her father's sister, the only one of the aunts who lived in this house and had taken charge of things since Mother's fall. "I wonder," Aunt May began hesitantly, "do you suppose we might take Vicky with us on the trip?" Aunt Laura's disgusted snort was the answer. "Don't be a ninny, May. Do you think we want that spoiled, sulky child ruining a trip we've looked forward to and are spending a good deal of money for? Her father has settled the matter. She will go to Turkey, and that is that." This was the moment. Vicky dared wait no longer. With her heart thudding in her ears, she tore down the stairs and flung herself into the living room. If everything hadn't been so desperate and tragic, she might have laughed at the shocked expressions on the four aunts' faces. "I won't go to Turkey," she shouted. The words came out much louder than she intended, but she kept right on. "I won't. I won't. I know you all hate me and don't want me around, but I won't go to Turkey." Aunt Laura recovered first. "Control yourself, Victoria," she snapped. "Little girls who eavesdrop are unlikely to hear much that is favorable said about them. Of course you will go to Turkey. You have nothing to say about it, actually. Please take that scowl off your face and get back to bed where you belong." Aunt May said, "Oh, Vicky dear," helplessly, and fell silent. "I can't leave school before the term is over. You ought to know that," Vicky said rudely, marshalling her arguments. The eldest of the aunts snorted through her nose again. "Perhaps I'd better tell you something, Victoria. It is unfortunate that it must be broken to you like this, but I had a long talk with your teacher and with the principal of your school 2 days ago. You are failing in all your subjects but one, and there's not the faintest chance of your being promoted at the end of the term. Mr. Albright says it will be necessary for you to stay behind and take the year over." "Oh, no," Aunt May cried in alarm. "Vicky is such a bright girl, she couldn't possibly fail." Not bright enough to work at her studies and make a passing grade. Aunt Laura said, "This is going to be a fine thing to report to her father, who is undoubtedly a brilliant man, even though a bit eccentric." Vicky said nothing at all. The hot anger was seeping away, leaving in its place a queer, cold lump in the pit of her stomach. She knew things hadn't been going well in school for some time. She couldn't remember exactly how far back it was that things had started changing, but somewhere she had got off on a wrong foot. Then had come that scrape she and some of the other girls had become involved in, and for which she had been blamed as the leader. Certainly, it had been her idea to climb in a window and explore that empty old house on Hillcrest Road, and the others had been willing enough to follow her. Only it hadn't been empty, and the woman who had just moved in as caretaker had trapped them upstairs and had phoned the police. They hadn't done any real damage, but there had been some vandalism around town, and this caused an uproar. A lot of people had been critical of Victoria Stewart. She was clearly a difficult girl who got other people's daughters in trouble. There had been head shaking among some of the teachers at school, and Aunt Laura had a conniption. Afterward, it had been hard to think about lessons, and suddenly Vicky hadn't cared anymore. What Aunt Laura had just revealed wasn't really a surprise. A shock, yes, but not a surprise. Mr. Albright had seen it coming. He had even had a talk with Mother once or twice. Vicky had promised to improve, and Mother had not told the aunts or even written to Dad about it. Yet Vicky had not buckled down to work. The wrong foot, once started, kept right on putting itself forward. Now the worst had happened. The thing she had in some queer way been daring to happen, and it felt quite awful. To fail, to be the only one of the whole class left behind while her friends went on, that was too dreadful to contemplate. Everyone was against her, and nothing was much use anymore. The aunts rustled among themselves, tisk-tisking furiously, all except soft-hearted Aunt May, who had begun to dab at her eyes with a handkerchief and to sniffle softly. "I see what I must do," she said between sniffles, and the other three stopped whispering and stared at her. "I'll give up the trip and stay home with Vicky. Then perhaps she can work hard this last month or so, and she won't have to be sent off to Turkey, where she doesn't want to go. After all, I'm not a very good sailor." "I'm sure to get seasick," and the other three aunts pounced on her indignantly. They told her she was to stop making a doormat of herself, that an ungrateful child like Victoria was not worth such a sacrifice, and, of course, she would go on the trip. She had been looking forward to it more than any of them, and they wouldn't listen to such nonsense. Vicky swallowed hard over the cold lump that now seemed to be wedged in her throat. She stammered a little when she spoke and hated the sign of her own weakness. The one thing she didn't want the aunts to guess was how awful she felt. Maybe I could stay with Margie until Mother is well again, or till I can go to camp. Margie's mother. Do you think Margie's mother would take such a responsibility?" Aunt Laura demanded. "Do you think any mother in this town would put up with you for more than an overnight visit? You used to be a nice enough child, but you've been changing lately. I might tell you, young lady, that there are mothers in this town who don't think you are a good influence for their daughters. That last scrape when you led Margie and the others into—" "Don't," Aunt May pleaded. "Don't scold her now. Vicky dear, Istanbul must be a fascinating city, and your father writes that there's another girl your age in the house where you'll stay. Adria March, a girl whose mother is from this very town. That witch girl." Aunt Laura broke in. "I saw the child a couple of years ago when her parents brought her home on a visit. She's probably worse than ever now, what with her father and mother killed in." Aunt May stood up with more firmness than she usually displayed. "That's quite enough," she said. "Can't you see how Vicky feels? Not one of us has a child of her own, but at least I can remember what it was to be young. I can remember how much it hurts sometimes to be young. Please go home now, all of you. Vicky's father has decided what must be done, and Vicky and I want to talk it over. Come upstairs, dear." Aunt May held out a cool, thin hand and took hold of Vicky's perspiring fingers. In spite of all the things she longed to say, in spite of wanting to tell the aunts off once and for all, Vicky found herself climbing the stairs beside Aunt May, holding tightly to her hand, as she had done when she was small and worried about crossing streets. At the top of the stairs, Aunt May put an arm around her shoulders, and they went into Vicky's bedroom. It was a pretty room, with yellow primrose wallpaper and a view that looked out upon a weeping willow tree and the river beyond, a view she would have to give up for some dreadful faraway place where people didn't even speak her language and where she had no friends. She felt too limp, however, to struggle anymore. The only thing she wanted was to get to her mother, to have mother's arms safely and reassuringly about her, to know that someone loved her, no matter what. But mother was out of reach and not to be worried. Her father, thinking of Dad, made everything worse. As Aunt Laura had said, he was a very brilliant man and occupied with his own work and interests. It seemed as though she had been on better terms with him when she was little than she was now. Because of his teaching, most of the young people he knew were of college age, and he didn't have much in common with a 12-year-old. He would never, never understand how a daughter of his could fail in school. Facing her father would be the hardest thing of all. Aunt May turned on a yellow-shaded lamp that matched the wallpaper. It had been a present from Mother last Christmas. When she had tucked Vicky into bed, she sat down with Dad's letter in her hand. "Just think," she said, trying hard to sound sprightly and bright. "Your father is living in the old house of a Turkish pasha. This American woman, Mrs. Byrne, whose husband is a civil engineer, has taken over this fascinating house and is running it as a pension, a sort of boarding house for Americans." Aunt May was trying so hard that Vicky felt a little sorry for her. After all, none of this was Aunt May's fault, and she had been willing to give up her trip around the world in order to help. "What's a pasha?" Vicky asked, though she didn't really care. "A pasha, let's see now. I'm not quite sure. Wait a minute till I get the dictionary from my room." She hurried off, leaving a whiff of violet perfume bed her. Vicky closed her eyes and lay very still. She couldn't bear facing the kids at school once they knew. Not even Margie, who wasn't awfully clever but would have no trouble passing. While she, Vicky Stewart, who had the most enterprising ideas and was looked up to by quite a few people, it didn't bear thinking about. But how could she stop when her thoughts were seething and the pain of coming disgrace stabbed through her like the beginning of a very bad toothache? Aunt May came hurrying back with the big dictionary in her arms. "Here you are," she said, plumping it down on the bed. "Listen to this. Pasha, formerly an honorary title, placed after the name given to officers of high rank in Turkey, as to governors of provinces, military commanders, etc. There were 3 classes of pashas, whose rank was formerly distinguished by 1, 2, or 3 horsetails borne on their standards, 3 tails marking the highest rank." Isn't that interesting? I wonder if this pasha had 3 horsetails. On his standard, that is. Vicky couldn't have cared less, but Aunt May looked as though she might begin to cry in earnest, and then Vicky's own tears would never hold back. "What did Aunt Laura mean about that girl being a witch?" she asked. Aunt May drew a long, sniffing breath, dabbed at her eyes, and tried to control her emotion. "Oh, you know, Laura, she doesn't understand young people very well. Adria seemed an attractive girl to me. You didn't meet her because you were away at camp, but her mother and your mother were very dear friends when they were young. In fact, it was Adria's father who was teaching art in Turkey and persuaded your father to come out to join the staff at the girls' college. It was tragic when both Adria's father and mother were killed in a mountaineering accident in Switzerland. They were caught by an avalanche, I believe. It happened only last year. I don't quite know how Adria happens to be staying on in Turkey with Mrs. Byrne." "But why did Aunt Laura use a word like witch about her?" Vicky persisted. Aunt May closed her eyes, trying to remember. "I recall that there was something a little strange about Adria. Of course, she was only 10 at the time I saw her. She often seemed to be thinking of something else, as if she were in a daydream way off from everyday affairs. And she had a way of walking, of running, almost as if she floated. Such a graceful little thing. I remember the way she laughed, too. It sounded like a silver flute." Aunt May broke off as if she found herself wandering too far afield, and wound up rather lamely. "I'm sure she's a pleasant girl, and you two will be good friends." Vicky doubted this. She did not think at the moment that she would ever have any friends at all, ever again. Turkey, she said, and somehow her unhappiness, her despair, got into the very sound of the word. Men in fezzies with dozens of wives in veils, and no camp, no fun all summer, no Margie, nothing. She did not mention being cut off from mother, which was the worst thing of all. I don't think Turkey is quite like that anymore, Aunt May said. Since Alan, your father, went out there, I've been reading about it, and I've studied the map of Istanbul that he sent home. She went to the table where Vicky's neglected school books were stacked and got a pad and pencil. Look, dear, here's a sketch of the way the city sprawls across two worlds. She began to draw rapidly on the paper, and as she drew, she talked, becoming a little excited about her own words. You know, Istanbul, they used to call it Constantinople, is a city where Europe and Asia meet. The two continents come together at this strait that is the Bosporus. All this squiggly gray part I've marked in is Istanbul and its suburbs. The school where your father teaches is a very famous college up here on the European side of the Bosporus, where I've put an X. And here's another fascinating thing about the city, Vicky. Look at the way it straddles another waterway that divides old Istanbul from the newer part. This inlet is the famous Golden Horn, with two bridges across it, connecting the two parts of the city. I can almost see what it must be like. Perhaps I'll see it too on this trip we're taking. Mention of the trip brought her attention back to Vicky, and she looked sad again. I wish I could help, dear. I know how painful this must be for you. I wish Laura— It doesn't matter, Vicky said. At least Aunt May wouldn't remind her that if only she had worked harder. That was the dreadful thing. The fact that it was absolutely too late, that what was done was so thoroughly done that nothing could now be changed. It was breaking up a part of her life. Vicky propped herself up in bed on one elbow and reached out to Aunt May. Do I have to go back to school tomorrow? Please, can't we hurry about getting me off to Turkey? So I won't have to explain a lot of things that will be hard to explain? Oh dear, Aunt May said. I'm not sure. I ought to consult. Then she took Vic's hand firmly. No, you won't consult anyone. Your mother is too ill, and your aunts would only object. I'll make the decision myself. You may drop out of school now, Vicky. Under the circumstances, I don't suppose it will matter. Tomorrow we'll see about your passport and what shots you need, and start getting your clothes ready. Will that suit you, dear? Vicky nodded, her eyes blurry. Nothing mattered a great deal, but to escape was of some help. Aunt May leaned over and kissed her cheek. Will you be all right now, dear? You won't walk about? In my sleep? Vicky said. I don't think so. This was something she used to do when she was little, but the only time she had done it recently was the night after Mother had been taken to the hospital and no one knew how bad her injuries might be. Aunt May turned out the light. Go to sleep, Vic dear, and dream about the city on the Golden Horn. Sleep late in the morning. There's no need now to get up early. No need now. The words seemed to echo after her as Aunt May closed the door. Vicky lay in the soft spring darkness, listening to the whisper of the newly green willow tree that had lulled her to sleep for as long as she could remember. But she did not think of the willow or of Istanbul. She thought only of broken pieces of her life that could not be mended. So needlessly broken. That was the awful part. She knew perfectly well that she wasn't a stupid girl, nor even a lazy one. Suddenly, she was filled with a disliking that shook her and brought stormy tears. Not disliking for her teachers or Mr. Albright, not for Aunt Laura or her two sisters, but only for Vicky Stewart, who had brought disgrace upon herself and must now run away to hide in a foreign land. I must go to sleep, she told herself. Only in sleep would there be forgetfulness. But it was hard to sleep when her world had turned upside down, and she didn't know how to pick up any of the pieces. 2. Meeting in Istanbul. Only the breathless rush of the following days made them to endure. No one had to be told now about her failure in school, and Vicky managed to put on enough of a performance so that not even her best friends suspected what she was suffering inside. She told them she didn't want to go to Istanbul and let that account for her lack of excitement about the things that were happening to her. A week before she left, a letter came from her father, When she was alone, she read it over and over and did not show it to Aunt May or to her mother in the hospital. He wrote about how beautiful Turkey was and what a fascinating time she would have in Istanbul. But he didn't explain these terms so that she could see and hear and taste and touch what he was telling her. Beautiful Istanbul meant nothing at all. The one interesting thing he mentioned in his letter, he didn't elaborate on. In one place, he said, "You'll be interested to know that there's a castle near where we are living," and let it go at that. Apparently, he remembered the collection of castle pictures she had started when she was younger and still kept up whenever she found one to cut from a magazine. It might be fun to see a real castle. In another paragraph, he had started to write something about Adria March and then scratched it out as though he'd changed his mind. Following the scratched out part, he wrote, "Adria is having a bad time recovering from the shocking loss of her parents. Mrs. Byrne is a distant cousin, I believe, and is taking care of her for the time being. I'm afraid this is rather a burden for her. Her husband is a civil engineer and away a good deal of the time, working on the building of new roads in Turkey. They have a son, Kenneth, who is about 6 months older than you are. I'm afraid he doesn't get along very well with Adria, but I hope you and Ken will be friends." All this was baffling, and when it was added to what Aunt Laura and Aunt May had said about Adria March, it made an odd picture. Vicky had a feeling that she wasn't going to like Adria any more than Ken did. About Ken, she would have to wait and see. Dad concluded with a paragraph that warned her of the fact that it was difficult to have her come to Istanbul without her mother. She would be pretty much in Mrs. Byrne's charge, and he hoped she would do her best to be nice to everyone. He said nothing at all about her failure in school, though Aunt Laura had written him airmail concerning it, and he must have known the worst by the time he wrote this letter. In any case, it was a letter she found herself resenting. Especially that last paragraph. Why couldn't he take it for granted that she would do her best and behave well, instead of hinting that she might not, and warning her that she wasn't really welcome? She began to dig in her heels, as Aunt Laura called it, in resistance against her father and everything connected with Istanbul. The worst part of leaving came when she said goodbye to her mother. Aunt May took her to the hospital that day and left her alone in the two-bedroom where her mother lay beside the window, looking pale and weak. It broke her heart to have Mother trying so hard to make the best of things when she was in pain and so terribly discouraged as well. At least it was helpful that her mother didn't know about her failure at school. It's a shame that I had to spoil all our plans with that silly fall," she said. "It would have been much nicer if you and I could have gone to Istanbul together next year, as we'd planned to do when your father was sure he wanted to stay on at this teaching post in Turkey. At least the doctor was not altogether discouraging today. He said I seemed to be mending well. So who knows? Perhaps you'll see me there before you expect me." Vicky could not place much hope in her words. She had heard the grave way the doctor had discussed her mother's case with Aunt May. There was the very real possibility that she might be an invalid for some time to come, even when she left the hospital. A nurse would come home with her and take care of her for a time at least, and a trip to Istanbul seemed out of the question. Before Vicky left the hospital, her mother spoke of Adria, or at least she spoke of how fond she had been of Adria's mother, and how she had grieved over her death. They had been best friends when they were Vicky's age and all through high school and college. It was a tragic loss for Adria, and Vicky must be very kind to her. There it was again. Be nice, be kind. Words that somehow rubbed her the wrong way, even from Mother, and made her want to be anything but nice. All too soon, visiting hours were up, and Vicky fought unsuccessfully to hold back her tears. Telling Mother goodbye was like cutting herself off from all love and comfort and reassurance. All the way home on the bus, she was silent and prickly and not very nice to her aunt. She had a horrid feeling inside that she wanted to hurt others as much as she was being hurt, though she knew that made no sense at all. On the day of her departure, all 4 of the aunts put her on the plane to New York. Vicky felt like a doll that was being handed about and made to do all sorts of things without any will of her own. Then a pretty, smiling stewardess took her in charge, and she boarded the plane with other passengers. All through the trip, the stewardesses were kind to her, and so were some of the other passengers. Though faces changed when she was transferred to a jet in New York, everyone seemed anxious to look out for her and make her trip pleasant. New impressions began to come so fast that everything blurred together. She slept and ate and slept again. They touched down at London, at Frankfurt, at Munich, and time ceased to have any meaning since it changed constantly as they flew east to meet the sun. Sometimes on the way she thought about Dad, and her memory played her a queer trick. Though he had been gone from home for less than a year, she could not remember exactly how he looked or how he sounded. She could remember only a sense of sternness about him when she did not measure up to his expectations. Not that he scolded, but he would go off and shut himself away with his work, as though he put her completely out of his mind. If this happened in Turkey, what was she to do? The trip was nearly over now, and a stewardess leaned toward her and pointed to the window. "That's the Sea of Marmara down there on your right. We're flying over eastern Thrace now, the name they give to Turkey in Europe. Our flight is quite late, I'm afraid, but I'm sure your father will meet you. Don't worry about a thing." Vicky managed a stiff smile. Don't worry about a thing? Yet all she could do was worry. Not about those matters which seemed to concern the stewardess, but about the look she would find on her father's face when she first saw him. It would be a look that would tell her he knew that Alan Stewart's daughter had not made a passing grade in school. When they left the plane at Istanbul, another passenger helped her, and just as Vicky's suitcase was cleared, a young woman in uniform came to say that Stewart's friends were waiting and she could come right along. Somehow that did not sound reassuring, and Vicky followed her uncertainly toward the waiting room. Clearly her father wasn't there. Instead, an American woman and a boy came forward to greet her. The woman was large and breezy of manner. She held out her hand in a way that did not concentrate on Vicky, as if she was thinking of something else as she shook hands. "I'm Mrs. Byrne," she said, "and this is my son Kenneth. Your father had an important appointment in town this afternoon, and since your flight was so late, he couldn't meet your plane as he intended. Is that all your baggage? Do lend a hand, Ken. And let's hurry. We've a long drive home." Vicky handed the heavier bag to Ken. She still felt breathless and a little confused, simply from coming so far so fast. She couldn't even be sure whether she was hurt or only relieved over the fact that her father had not come to meet her, and the moment she dreaded still lay ahead. As they walked outside, she stole a glance at Kenneth Byrne. He was taller than she and quite good-looking, with carroty hair and lots of freckles. His eyes were bright blue, and there was a teasing look about them that matched his grin when he caught her looking at him. He carried her suitcase easily as he followed his mother with an every stride. Vicky had trouble keeping up with the two long-legged Americans. When they reached the small English car, Ken put the bags in the trunk and opened the door for Vicky to sit in the back seat. He sat up in front with his mother. Daylight was fading as they followed the highway through rolling Turkish countryside. As she drove, Mrs. Byrne asked questions that were easy enough to answer, about the plane trip, about Vicky's mother and home. "It's too bad your father couldn't meet you," she went on in her offhand way. "You know he's making a study of Turkish wall ceramics, and the man he had to see is down from Ankara just for today. But he'll be home for dinner tonight. Adria couldn't come either. She's in bed with a cold. You know about Adria, I suppose? I'm afraid she's having a difficult time right now. Sometimes I hardly know what to do about her. I'll admit that I've had more experience raising boys than girls. Ken has 2 grown-up brothers back in the States." The red-haired boy looked around from his place in the front seat. "Adria is a crazy one," he said. "Don't talk like that," his mother chided and changed the subject. "Do you see those walls ahead of us, Vicky? They're the old land walls of Istanbul, built to protect the city on the land side. Hundreds of years old they are." By now the sun was setting, but Vicky could see the crumbling walls stretching out to right and left of the gap where the road cut through. the line broken by thick towers that had once been square but were now disintegrating into rubble. Ken had no interest in the walls. "That was sure a nutty thing Adria did yesterday, Mom. Out in the rain like, never mind, dear," his mother said. "She's paying for it by having to stay in bed today. I'm sure Vicky will be good for Adria. She needs another girl in the house." Ken snorted impolitely, but did not explain the reason for his doubt. Vicky began to feel a certain sympathy for the odd, mysterious Adria. It was rather novel to have someone else in trouble instead of herself. The wide boulevard went under the arch of an ancient Roman aqueduct, and soon they were passing modern apartment buildings in a pleasant residential section. Gradually, the road narrowed and the traffic increased as they followed the cobblestones and sharp turns of old city streets. It was growing too dark to see very much, but against a sky of fading gold and amethyst were silhouetted the rounded shapes of mosques and the many needle-like points of minarets. Mrs. Byrne drove anxiously now, with considerable worry about other cars. "The way Turks drive," she said in annoyance as a car cut recklessly across her path. "Believe me, I can hardly wait to get back to the USA and stay there for good." "Turkey's not so bad when you get used to it," Ken said. Mrs. Byrne was concentrating on the snarl of traffic as the road descended toward a strip of water. "The Golden Horn," she said, "for whatever it's worth to you." She sounded as though it wasn't worth very much to her. Vicky remembered Aunt May drawing the lines of a map. Now the lines were suddenly alive. They were boats on a dark strip of water and lights climbing the hills ahead and behind. They were a bridge crossing from old Istanbul into the new, where homes and banks and hotels rose on every hand. Vicky thought of a question she wanted to ask. "Dad wrote that there was a castle near where you live," she said. "Is it a real castle from the old days?" "Castle?" Mrs. Byrne repeated doubtfully. "Oh, you must mean Rumeli Hisar. It's a fortress on the Bosporus. We'll drive around the base of it this evening, but it will be too dark to see anything. You'll have a good view from your room in the morning. It's real enough, and more than 500 years old, I think." The drive out toward the suburb of Bebek, near which Mrs. Byrne lived, was a long one. In the back seat, Vicky began to feel a bit sleepy, lulled by the swish of passing traffic and the dancing of lights on the fine new highway. She drowsed until Mrs. Byrne spoke again. "Here's our hill," she said, and turned up a narrow, winding road that climbed upward from the water. Vicky roused herself and sat up, but there were only a few scattered lights to be seen out there in the darkness. As they made a final turn, the shape of a large house with lighted windows loomed beside the road. Mrs. Byrne turned the car into a driveway and drew up before a modern garage. "Welcome to our Pasha's palace," she announced. "Jump out, Ken, and help with the bags. Your father isn't home yet, Vicky. The Volkswagen isn't here." So again, the meeting with her father was to be postponed for a while. Vicky got out of the car and stood looking up at the house. It was a large, two-story structure, oblong and box-like in shape, with a gently slanting roof. The part that extended toward the Bosporus was well lighted, while the uphill section stood dark and a little forbidding. It was odd to see a house cut in half by its low lights. A wide veranda ran along the entire back at the second-floor level, and she could make out long windows beyond the veranda, closed and shuttered tight. To her right, across the driveway, she could glimpse a dark garden, with trees rustling softly in a breeze that blew uphill from the water. "Was he a three-horsetail pasha?" she asked sleepily. Ken said, "What?" and Mrs. Byrne laughed. "I know what she means, Ken. I suspect that he was a rather unimportant pasha, since the house was not built on the water's edge and is far from being a real palace. Come along inside, Vicky. Ken will bring your bags." Breeze against Vicky's face had the cool touch of early May, with enough sharpness to waken her and clear away some of the cobwebby unreality. She followed Mrs. Byrne through a rear door and into a narrow hall. This in turn opened into a much grander hall, where wide stairs mounted to a landing and turned upward to the floor above. The lower hall was a great room in itself, a room with a stone-paved floor and a tiled fountain in the center. A tiger cat ran across their path, and Mrs. Byrne said, "Shoo," and clapped her hands at it. "Sometimes I think Turkey has more cats than anything else," she said. Except for a bench or two, there was no furniture in the stone-floored room, and it seemed a cold place tonight, though it might be pleasant during a hot Turkish summer. The polished stairs were rugless, and electric sconces lighted the way up. "You'll find the house more Victorian than Turkish," Mrs. Byrne said. "It's somewhat less than 100 years old, and it was built when wealthy Turks thought it fashionable to copy the styles of Western Europe. Though there are Turkish touches too. Tell her about the haremlik, Ken, and take her up to her room, will you? I must go and see what's happening to dinner." A pretty Turkish maid came out to speak to Mrs. Byrne. She wore a printed house dress and white apron. Her hair was hidden beneath a white square of cloth tied about her head. Mrs. Byrne waved a casual hand at Vicky, who had started upstairs after Ken. "Adria knows you're arriving. Do run in and see her before you come downstairs. Ken will show you her room." Then she was gone, and Vicky was climbing the wide, dark stairs beneath a lofty ceiling that seemed to vanish high overhead. 3. Adria. The stairs opened into a large salon above, furnished with comfortable modern sofas and tables, chairs, and lamps, though all were set about sparsely because of the space they had to fill. Here and there a few richly colored oriental rugs were scattered. A wide hall ran the entire length of the house, taking in one side of the salon and terminating at the far end before huge closed doors. "Mom keeps that part shut off," Ken said. "The house is too big for us to use all of it. In the beginning, she rented rooms and small apartments to Americans living out here. But now that Dad is being transferred home in the fall, it's not worth bothering with. So we occupy the Salamlik part and take in a few friends. Dad's doing some work around Ankara now, so there's no one here but you and your father. Oh, and Adria, of course. That's the haremlik beyond those big doors." "I don't know what you mean by harem-like and salamlik," Vicky said, as she turned her back on the doors and went through the salon to the front end of the house. "The salamlik, this part, was the men's living quarters," Ken said. "The haremlik was for the women. All the old Turkish houses were built like that, even to having separate gardens and entrances. Adria says the Turkish ladies are still in there, rustling around in their silks and bangles, ready to pop a veil over their faces if a man shows up who doesn't belong to their family. But what can you expect from Adria? Watch out for her, or you'll start being goofy too." The presence of Turkish ladies seemed an odd notion, but then almost everything seemed odd at the moment, and Vicky made no comment. She didn't mean to judge Adria until she saw her for herself. Ken pushed open a door and turned a switch. Overhead, a lovely chandelier came into glowing life. Prisms and crystal teardrops split the light into miniature rainbows and illumined the room with bright radiance. "You must rate," Ken said. "This is one of the best rooms in the house. I don't know why such a fuss was made to put you here, especially when—" He broke off and grinned as he set down her bags. "Especially when you're in disgrace." Vicky stared at him in dismay, and he winked like a conspirator. "Never mind. I don't always get good marks in school either. At least you'll have a few extra weeks of vacation this way." So her father had told, Vicky thought miserably. She did not like Kenneth Byrne very much, she decided. Wishing he would go away, she put her feelings into one of her darkest scowls. "Okay," he said. "I get it. You needn't bite me. We'll be having dinner soon, so you'd better wash up. The bathroom is just beyond the stairs at the start of the long hall. Adria's room is right across from it. If you want to stop in to see her, I wish you luck." He left the door open when he went out, and Vicky made no move to close it. Compared with her bedroom at home, this room seemed enormous. The ceiling was high and distant, with a diamond-shaped design in its wood paneling. The windows were very tall, with dark-figured green draperies shrouding them. She went to the nearest one and parted the curtains to peer out, but it was too dark to see very much. She could make out the veranda running past, with arches and slender pillars framing the outside edge. The night seemed dark and cold, and she shut it away hastily and turned back to the brilliance of her room. The feeling that she had been holding off all this time came close now and threatened to engulf her in misery. It was a loneliness that had started back home when she had said goodbye to her mother, and it had been growing stronger ever since. In it, there was a longing for her own little room with the whispery willow tree outside, a longing for her mother, even for Aunt May, who loved her and was her own family. Here, there seemed to be no one she belonged to, or who belonged to her. She took off her hat and coat and laid them on the bed as if she were a visitor who would be leaving soon. She made no move to open her bags, and she did not look at herself in the shadowy mirror over the big old-fashioned dressing table that was all curlicues and carving. There was no friendly welcome here, and she wanted to escape the room as quickly as possible. Gathering up the towel and soap that had been laid out for her, she went down the echoing hallway to the bathroom. With a sidelong glance, she noted Adria's door. It stood ajar, and a faint sound emerged from it, a sort of whispered chant that she could not understand. Washing made her feel a little better. She hadn't realized how sticky and grimy she was from the trip. A bit of tugging with a comb helped to get her hair in order, and when she had taken her towel back to her room, she was ready for the next step. The open door of Adria's room seemed to beckon her. So many strange things had been said about Adria March that she was curious to see for herself what this girl was like. Besides, she had no desire to run downstairs immediately and find herself again in Kenneth Burns' company. Adria might be the lesser of two evils, and she needn't stay more than a moment, time enough to say hello. Nevertheless, she approached the open doorway uncertainly. The odd, murmuring whisper still sounded from the room. Should she knock? She wondered. Was someone in there with Adria? Gathering up her courage, she stepped across the sill and stood on the threshold of Adria's room. It was a smaller room than her own, and there were fewer windows, though the ceiling was as remote and high, the furniture large and old-fashioned. A shaded lamp burned on a bureau, and a modern reading lamp had been attached to the head of the bed, pouring its light down upon a slight, fair-haired figure sitting up against huge pillows. Adria March was the prettiest thing Vicky had ever seen. She was like one of those advertisements in a fashion magazine, all perfection and not quite real. Her hair, falling gracefully over her shoulders, caught the golden glint of the lamp over her head. A wide blue band of ribbon held it back from a forehead unpuckered and smooth. At the moment, Adria's eyes were tightly closed, and her lips were moving, murmuring words over and over, but so softly that Vicky could not make them out. The girl had drawn her knees up beneath the covers, and her two fists were clenched upon them, the only sign of tension in evidence. Vicky hesitated uneasily, not knowing whether to advance another step into the room or turn and go quietly away. She shifted her weight, trying to make up her mind, and a board creaked beneath her feet. The girl in the huge bed stopped whispering and opened her eyes. They were not blue eyes, as Vicky had expected, but sea gray, rainy day gray, and they stared at Vicky as though they could see through her and behind her and all around her. It was such a strange look that Vicky blinked the lids over her own brown eyes several times. Someone had to speak, and since the girl in the bed did not, Vicky made an effort. Mrs. Burns said I should stop in and say hello, but if you're saying your prayers or something, I'll just... The yellow gold head moved quickly from side to side. Don't go away. I know who you are. May your coming be pleasant. That's what we say in Turkey. I wasn't praying. I was telling myself who I am. Vicky frowned in bewilderment, and the girl in the bed laughed out loud. It was a light, silvery sound, and Vicky remembered what Aunt May had said about a flute. Don't frown at me, said Adria. Haven't you ever tried to tell yourself who you are? I do it often. There are 3 ways. I am Adna, am Adria, I am Adria, but I can't be sure which one does it best. So I try them all, over and over. Sometimes it helps a great deal. Sometimes it surprises me, and I start wondering who Adria really is. It was difficult to find anything to say in response to such a surprising statement, as if a person could lose track of who she was. But Vicky couldn't stand there saying nothing again, and with an effort she wiped the frown from her forehead and said the first ordinary thing that came into her head. I'm sorry about your cold. Adria's smile made her look prettier than ever, but it was not exactly a happy smile. It's not a cold, she said. Cousin Janet, that's Mrs. Byrne, who is a very distant relative, worries about her responsibility to me. reciprocity. She thinks I ought to catch cold after what happened yesterday, so she put me to bed. I'm glad you've come. I was getting bored. Did they tell you what I did? Vicky shook her head. Ken mentioned something about the rain. Adria laughed again. It wasn't the rain that mattered, at least not the wetness of it. Getting wet was an accident. It was the sounds I wanted to hear. Do you ever listen to sounds, Victoria? Everyone calls me Vicky, Vicky said lamely. She had never in her life felt so bewildered by another girl her own age as she felt with this strange, rather beautiful young person in the bed. I'll call you Victoria, Adria said. It's fun to roll out all those syllables. They have a wonderful sound. She slipped out of bed and ran barefoot across to a window, pushed the shutters wide, and leaned her pajama-clad elbows upon the sill. Come here and listen, she said. Drawn in spite of her bewilderment, Vicky went to the window. There was no veranda here. The window looked out toward the winding road that Mrs. Byrne had followed up the hill. At first, she heard only the wind in the trees, but then her ears caught other sounds. Frogs croaking the darkness, the distant barking of a dog, a mournful, drawn-out whistle nearer at hand. That's a boat whistle, isn't it? She asked. It sounds eke our riverboats at home. The girl beside her nodded. The Bosporus is down there. I can't see it from window, the way can from yours, but there are always sounds to be somewhere. Garden of birdsong suddenly trilled, and Adria put a hand on Vicky's arm to hold her. The last sweet note had lost itself in velvet darkness. A nightingale, Adria said softly, and Vicky felt a queer little prickle go up the back of her neck. A nightingale. She had actually heard a nightingale. My father used to say that hearing was as important as seeing because of all it could make feel. You know about my father? Look, I'll show you. The slender, graceful figure in blue pajamas, bright hair dancing as she moved, flew across the room and turned on a light switch. A chandelier, not quite so as the Vicky's, sprang to gloving life, and Adria moved toward a wall of the room. Except for one thing, the wall was completely bare, and all furniture had been moved away from it. In Ear Raider, plainly a place of honor, hung a framed painting. There was no glass covering it to reflect light and blur the picture. Adria waved a hand at it proudly. My father was an artist, a very good artist. I think he might have been great and famous someday, if he there in Switzerland when the avalanche came down. She spoke so calmly that Vicky stole a startled look at wondering if she herself could have spoken without tears of an accident that had taken the lives of her parents only a short while before. Adria's face was ashine with and pride, but at the moment she wasn't grieving. Listen to it, she said. Listen to all the sounds he painted into that picture. Vicky stared at the rainy forest scene as if she had been hypnotized. A storm was sweeping through the trees, streaming through tortured, outflung branches, and she could imagine the roar of the wind, the staccato beat of rain, the wet slap of dead leaves hurled against a tree trunk. Adria was right. She had never thought of listening to a picture, but the man who had painted this one had been thinking of sounds. The sensation was strange, something she had never experienced before. With one of her lightning movements, Adria switched off the chandelier and returned to her bed, pulling up the covers. Do you believe in spells? She asked. Keeping up with Adria was a little like flying in a plane, Vicky thought. Everything went too fast and she felt left behind, with much that was in the past not yet understood or finished with. Of course I don't believe in spells, she said. At least I haven't since I was about 6. Adria watched her soberly for a moment. No, I suppose you wouldn't. But don't forget, this is Turkey. Very strange things can happen here. I had my fortune told by a gypsy who is a friend of mine. She held her hand palm up toward Vicky. She told me there was a spell in my hand, but she wouldn't tell me what it meant. The sound of a Chinese gong boomed musically through the house, and Adria flicked her fingers at Vicky. That's the signal for dinner, Victoria. You'd better run. I'll see you tomorrow. As quickly as that, Vicky found herself shut out. It was as though a door had closed in her face. Adria had shut her eyes, and her lips were moving once more in a faint, whispery sound. More than a little dazed, Vicky went into the hall salon. It looked vast and bare in spite of the furniture scattered around. A sound of voices and the odor of appetizing cooking drifted up the stairs. She dreaded going down there, but she couldn't very well retreat to her room, and in spite of all she had eaten on the plane, she found herself growing hungry. As she walked slowly toward the stairs, she closed her eyes and murmured to herself, "I am Vicky. I am Victoria. I am Vicky." But the words were not at all reassuring. She had the queer feeling that she had lost touch with Vicky Stewart and that some stranger inhabited her body and put queer thoughts into her mind. Did she believe in spells? Goodness, how silly could she get? She gave herself a good hard shake, and suddenly she was Vicky again. Quite cross and resentful, too, because her father had not bothered to come to the airport to meet her. A fine welcome she'd had, after coming all those thousands of miles across oceans and continents clear to the edge of Asia. She started down the bare stairway, her steps thumping firmly, disagreeably on the creaking steps, and made the turn at the landing. A man stood at the foot of the stairs, looking up at her. A man with a thick brown beard trimmed and shaped as neatly as a gardener might shape a hedge. White teeth flashed in the dark beard as he smiled at her, and she realized that the bearded man was her father. "Hello, Vicky," he said. "I'm awfully sorry I couldn't meet you." With the new beard, he didn't look like Dad, and she went down the stairs uncertainly, shyly. When she reached the second step from the bottom, he did not wait, but put his hands on her arms and swung her down to his level, enveloping her in a hug. She clung to him, her arms tightly about him, sudden tears in her eyes. This felt like Dad. If she didn't look at the beard, she could believe it was her father. "How are you, honey?" he said. "And how was Mother when you left?" She told him haltingly, and he kept an arm about her shoulders as they walked toward the dining room. The disagreeable mingling of depression and gloom lifted a little. At least he wasn't going to be stern right away and lecture about her failure in school. They walked into the dining room together, and she found it a big room, furnished with large, old-fashioned pieces that probably belonged to the house. Mrs. Byrne and Kenneth were waiting. The four of them were lost at the long table, even though they gathered at one end of it. As the Turkish girl brought in the food, Mrs. Byrne kept up a running conversation, and Dad joined in quietly, though infrequently. Now that he was across a table from her, Vicky found the beard once more got in the way. He seemed like a stranger, someone she had never seen before. Ken gave most of his attention to eating, though once he cocked an eyebrow at Vicky and asked under his breath if she had seen Adria. She nodded and let it go at that. She had not sorted out her reactions to Adria as yet, and she didn't want to talk about her to Ken. Dad must have caught the mention of Adria's name, for he asked Mrs. Byrne about her. "I hope she's feeling better," he said. "Has there been any trouble today?" Ken's mother sighed. "No more than usual. The child bewilders me completely. Her head is stuffed with the most utter rubbish. I can't think how her parents must have raised her, since she has such queer ideas." "I always liked Gerald March," Dad said. "He was something of a genius, and geniuses are seldom like other people. I suspect that Adria is as wildly imaginative as he was, which doesn't always make for practical everyday living. I suppose there's nothing much to do about her except be patient. She'll grow up eventually." Vicky caught the barest flick of a glance in her direction and found herself speaking a little defiantly. "Adria showed me a picture her father painted. That forest in a storm's picture that's hung on her wall. She showed me how to listen to it." Ken rolled his eyes. "I know, as if anybody could paint sounds," Dad chuckled. "I don't know but what that's an interesting idea." Again, he flicked a look in Vicky's direction, as if he wondered what she was thinking. She kept her eyes on her plate and said nothing more. It was safer just to eat. Fortunately, the food was delicious. There were little rounds of lamb and vegetables that had been cooked on skewers and served on pilaf. Kebab, Mrs. Byrne said, was a popular Turkish dish, and she had thought Vicky might enjoy it for dinner. Vicky did, and finished up every bite while her father began to speak with enthusiasm about the man he had interviewed today. An authority, very difficult to reach, he said, who had put him on the trail of some most unusual mosaics and tiles in a little-known mosque. Vicky paid little attention. Now that she had eaten, she was tired and sleepy, and she was beginning to feel cross again. Unpleasant thoughts were turning about in her mind, and she made no effort to push them away. Because of some old tiles, Dad had been too busy to come to the airport to meet his only daughter. In a way, it would have been more reassuring if he had scolded her right away about her failure in school. At least, that would have shown that he was thinking of her. Tiles on the walls of a mosque were more important to him than she was. By the time she had finished the cheese pastry and fruit that were served for dessert, Vicky had stirred up all her smoldering resentment against her father. When Mrs. Burns said, "Let's have our coffee in the sitting room," and moved back from the table, Vicky slipped gladly from her chair. "You children may be excused," Mrs. Burns said. "Ken, since this is Vicky's first evening here, perhaps you could." There was a dawning in Ken's eyes of reluctance to do whatever his mother was about to ask, so Vicky yawned widely. "I'm sleepy," she said. Mrs. Byrne nodded. "Of course you are. It will take a few days to adjust to the time change after your long trip. Would you like to see my Turkish sitting room before you go up to bed?" "A good idea," Dad said, but Vicky did not look at it. She wasn't interested in sitting rooms at this moment, but there was nothing to do but follow the others to a room that opened off the stone-paved hall. It was long and rather narrow, with arched windows along one side. "It's more Turkish in character than most of the house," Mrs. Burns said. "I've shopped in the bazaars and furnished it as authentically as I could." Under the windows were low, soft divans with colorful striped covers and bright cushions. Little tables, inlaid with mother-of-pearl or small pieces of decorative wood, were placed here and there. Several framed pictures hung on the walls, if you could call them pictures. As nearly as Vicky could make out, they seemed to represent the queer curves and dots of old Turkish writing. Dad noted the direction of her gaze and explained, "Since the religion of the country forbade any reproduction of human or animal figures, old Turkish art concerned itself with abstract design, such as you find in tile work and architecture. The Turks were interested in this sort of decorative calligraphy, or writing. Those framed examples are probably quotations from the Quran, the book that is to Muslims what our Bible is to us. They often use this sort of thing instead of pictures on the walls. These seem to be fine specimens, Mrs. Byrne." He sounded terribly like a professor lecturing, Vicky thought crossly, but Mrs. Byrne seemed pleased by his approval. Ken's mother was a lot older than her own mother, Vicky decided critically, and too big. It pleased her to find as many things wrong as possible. Mrs. Byrne moved to a corner cabinet of glass in which was arranged an assortment of small figures and animals, bowls, and tiny vases. They were of carved ivory and porcelain, cinnabar, ebony, and other exotic materials, Mrs. Byrne explained. For the first time, Vicky's interest came to life, and Ken's mother, noting it, went on enthusiastically. "I've been collecting these things for years. Some of them come from Africa and China and Japan." She forgot that Vicky was sleepy and opened the glass doors to take out a small golden object encrusted with tiny jewels that twinkled in the light. "I found this in the bazaar a few days ago. It's quite nice handwork." She held it out for Mr. Stewart and Vicky to see. Vicky looked at the jewel-set miniature that was a little like the curving horn of an animal. "Very nice," Dad said, taking it onto his palm. "It's a good piece. You must have done some bargaining for it." "I did. But when the dealer was sure I was going to walk out empty-handed, he came down almost to my offer." She turned it over, indicating a clasp on the back. "It's meant to be worn as a pin, but I wanted it for my collection. The stones are only semi-precious, of course." "It's appropriate," Dad said, "to have a golden horn from Istanbul. Go up to Sultan Selim Mosque sometime and look down at the water. By moonlight, or even in bright sunlight, the golden horn looks rather like this." Mrs. Byrne returned the brooch to its place beside a wooden rhinoceros from Cape Town. Then she turned again to Vicky. "I have one rule about this collection. No one touches these things but me. I even dust them myself. But if you're interested, I'll be happy to show you the pieces sometime. Now I know you want to get to bed. Is there anything you'd like before you go upstairs? Anything you need?" Vicky swallowed a yawn and said there was nothing. Her father gave her shoulder a pat. "Run along to bed, honey, before you fall asleep on your feet." Vicky said good night collectively to everyone and made no effort to go to her father for a hug and kiss. It was a relief to run upstairs alone and find her way to the door of her big corner room. Now she was prepared to stay in it and shut out the world. It was a strange room, but the world outside was even stranger and more unwelcoming. She opened her bag sleepily, undressed, and got into her pajamas. The real unpacking would have to wait until tomorrow, though she knew Aunt Laura would never approve. When she had run down the hall to the bathroom to wash and brush her teeth, she was ready for bed. She turned off the flood of light from the chandelier, but left a small lamp burning on the bed table. Then, somewhat doubtfully, she approached the high, old-fashioned bed. It was the biggest bed she had ever seen, with a headboard that rose up the wall in dark carving that culminated in a fat cupid at the top. There were 2 huge pillows and a great depth of covers and quilts. It was a bed made for a giant, and she felt quite inadequate to fill it. Not even Adria's bed was as big as this. Before she climbed into it, she would open a window, she decided. She chose one that was not on the veranda side and figured out how to work the catch so that the glass doors swung inward. As she was examining the fastening on the outer shutters, she heard a faint scratching sound behind her and whirled about, startled. She was alone in the room, and though she glanced uneasily toward shadowy comers, nothing moved. Then, quite softly, the scratching came again. Of course, it was at the door. She went to it and put her hand on the big brass doorknob. "Anyone there?" she asked. It couldn't be Dad. He would give the door a good bold knock, not scratch on it secretly. "Let me in. Let me in quickly," said Adria's voice. The door wasn't locked, and Vicky opened it at the awkward catch near the floor. In an instant, the slim figure in blue pajamas bounded into the room and shoved the door shut behind her, as though someone were in pursuit. 4 pattern of the horn. Vicky stared at her visitor in surprise. She was not sure she welcomed her at this moment, when she was ready for bed and so sleepy. The blue band of ribbon was gone from Adria's fair hair, and she had braided it into 2 long, thick pigtails for sleeping. The braids hung forward over each shoulder, and now and then Adria picked one up and tickled her nose with a wispy end. "I thought you might be lonesome tonight," she said. "I was when I came to this house for the first time. Now that I'm used to it, I like it. It's so queer and spooky, and there's so much history all around. If only Cousin Janet—" She did not finish her thought about Cousin Janet. Instead, she drew a hand from behind her back and held it out to Vicky. "I brought you a present." Dangling from her fingers was a string of blue beads a little longer than choker size, were cool and smooth to Vicky's fingers as she took them into her hands. "Put them under your pillow tonight," Adria said. "They're to keep away the evil eye." Then, without waiting for an answer, she took them back, ran across the room, and thrust them beneath a huge pillow on the bed. Next, she went to the shutters Vicky had been about to open and unlatched them, pushed them back, and fastened them with hooks against the wall. "There, you have a beautiful view. That band of dark down there is the Bosporus, and you can see the lights of Anatolia on the other side. That's Asian Turkey. We're in Europe. I have a friend at school who lives in a village over there." Vicky followed the quick, pointing finger with her eyes and saw the lights of a boat moving between the 2 shores. To her right, something huge and black blocked out a whole portion of the water, so that she had to look to either side to find the Bosporus. "The walls and towers down there belong to Rumeli Hisar," Adria said. "Our European side is called Rumeli, and Hisar means fortress. There's a fortress across on the Asian side too, Anadolu Hisar, but it's not as big, and this is the one I like best." Layla stayed inside the walls all night once, and no one knew. I'd like to do that myself if I had the chance. "Who is Layla?" Vicky asked, waking up a little in spite of herself. Adria held out her hand with the palm up as she had done before. "She's my gypsy friend, the one who told my fortune. The gypsies will be coming again soon. They bring down lavender from the hills and sell it in town every spring. Layla will know about what has happened to me. She'll find me, then I'll get her to tell my fortune again and show me what I must do to make it come true." Vicky knew what Ken would say to all this, but though Adria was strange, she made things interesting and she kept the loneliness away, for the moment at least. Adria shivered and turned back to the room. "It's cold tonight. I'm going to bed. You'd better go to bed too, instead of leaning out the window." This was hardly fair. since it was Adria who had opened the shutters and pointed out the view. But before Vicky could answer, Adria made one of her unexpected right-about turns and asked a point-blank question. "Is it true, Victoria, that you failed in your work at school so you won't be promoted with your class?" Vicky had endured all she could. Quite suddenly, she disliked Adria and Ken and Mrs. Byrne, and her father most of all. "That's nobody's business. Nobody's business at all," she cried. "Why don't you go away and leave me alone?" "My, but you get mad fast," she said calmly. "There's no use playing ostrich, you know. Even if you hide your head in a hole, we can see the refit of you. We ain't know you're a problem to your family. Cousin Janet has been worried about your coming because she already has what she calls a major problem with me. Of course, I'm glad you've come for that very reason. Now she won't concentrate on me so much." "Oh, go away," Vicky repeated crossly. She turned her back on Adria, kicked off her slippers, and crawled into the vast bed. When she had wormed her way down between cold sheets, she opened one eye and looked out at the room. Adria was still there, watching her. "When you were little and your mother was home, did she used to come and tuck you in at night?" Adria asked. "Of course," Vicky said gruffly. She reached out a hand and turned off the lamp beside her bed, leaving Adria in the dark, to go or stay as she pleased. Adria chose to go. She opened the door, and an flood of light from the hall streamed in. "My mother used to tuck me in too," she said, and went away, drawing the door very softly shut behind her. Now, what had she meant by bringing that up? Vicky wondered. But she did not think about Adria for long. How easily tears came when she was alone in the dark. There was a queer aching deep inside her, an aching that nothing seemed to help. She wasn't sure what it was that she ached for. She simply hurt and wept silently into the big pillow under her cheek. In spite of the hurting, however, she was tired and was just dozing off when she heard her father's voice speaking to her through the door. "Are you asleep, Vicky?" At once she knew what the aching came from. Adria had reminded her. It was because Dad hadn't thought of coming upstairs to say goodnight to her. Yet now that he was here, a queer thing happened. The knot of resentment and contrariness, which had begun to wind up inside her, rolled into a solid ball of resistance. She closed her eyes tightly and did not answer. When the door opened, the glow of light from the hall pressed against her closed lids, but she lay very still and tried to breathe deeply, as if she were asleep. After a moment of waiting, he went away, and when he had gone, she pounded her pillow fiercely with one fist. "Go back to your old tiles and your history," she whispered, and pounded the pillow again. She was glad he had gone without coming in. She did not want to speak to him at all. He would remember about school and lecture her, which she could not bear. It was bad enough that he had betrayed her to all these people. Why couldn't he have given her a chance to hold her head up and start out fresh with new friends? After all, that was why she had run away to Turkey. But because he had told, all her problems were here ahead of her, and everyone knew. Her father was a stranger with a beard anyway. She didn't really know him or want to. Her pounding fist had found the blue beads Adria had thrust under her pillow, and she drew them out and ran them through her fingers. Protection from the evil eye. She'd had enough of Adria, too. With a quick gesture, she flung the beads out into the dark room and heard them strike something and clatter to the floor. Now she wasn't even sleepy anymore. Why couldn't people leave her alone instead of waking her up when all she needed was a good rest? She turned and tossed in the expanse of the big, strange bed and wished for her narrow bunk at home. She tried lying on her back, lying on her stomach, and lying on each side. Nothing helped. Somewhere outside in the darkness, a voice began to sing. The first note a long, drawn-out A, melancholy and strange. Voice was a woman's, very clear and beautiful. But the song was like nothing she had ever heard before. It was mournful, heartbreaking, a few minor notes up and down a limited scale. Not music, as Vicky knew it, but something oriental and sad. Surely a song of loss and sacrifice and sorrow. Listening to it, Vicky began to feel that her own hurt and anger was being drawn out of her to center in a song that spoke for all who sorrowed anywhere. She wondered if Adria heard it too. Adria, whose grief was far more serious than her own. Sleep came easily and gently now, and Victoria Stewart did not waken again through all the long night. Indeed, she did not waken until well into the morning. When she opened her eyes, the eastern sun was pouring through the tall oblong of the open window, and the night shadows had vanished from the big room. Overhead, the chandelier caught the sunlight, enmeshing it cheerfully in its many prisms. Vicky yawned and stretched and rolled out of bed. When she looked into the hall, she found a rosy-cheeked maid bustling around the salon, dusting and polishing. The girl smiled at her and said what was probably good morning in Turkish. She made a gesture of eating and pointed to the stairs. Apparently, Vicky could still have breakfast, and she discovered that she was ravenously hungry. She returned the girl's smile before closing the door and looked at her watch. It was 10 o'clock, high time to be up and exploring. When she was ready to go downstairs, she felt much better than she had the night before. Nothing seemed quite so strange, and she no longer felt completely lonely and unloved and betrayed. It was true that her father, but she put the thought of him quickly from her mind. She did not want to remember pretending to be asleep when he had come upstairs last night. In the dining room, she had scrambled eggs, hot toast, and milk, plus a delicious jam that was like nothing she had ever tasted before. Mrs. Byrne looked in while she was eating, and though she seemed distracted and hurried, she made nothing of Vicky's oversleeping. Probably she was used to that with Ken. "Good morning," she said. "Have a good rest? You look fresh and bright. Wonder if you can manage for yourself this morning while I drive to market? Your father and Ken have gone, of course, but the servants are here, so you won't be alone." "I'll be fine," Vicky said, feeling so cheerful that she surprised herself. "Perhaps you can make your own bed when you've finished breakfast," Mrs. Byrne went on. "Then you can look around the house as much as you like, except for occupied bedrooms and my Turkish sitting room, which is private. You can go out in the garden too, but don't wander away outside until you know the neighborhood." Vicky nodded, her mouth full of toast and jam. Mrs. Byrne smiled as though in relief that Vicky had offered no objections. "That's Turkish rose petal jam you're eating," she said. "Ken likes it too." She started for the door, hesitated, and turned back. "I forgot to mention Adria. She's to stay in bed another day. Perhaps you'll keep an eye on her while I'm gone. You can visit if you like, but she's not to get up. See you later." She waved her hand and went quickly away, leaving Vicky to sip her milk and think over the fact that she had been left in charge of Adria. That, at least, was a task she didn't welcome. She had every intention of avoiding Adria's room. The more she thought about Adria, in broad daylight, the more she felt inclined to agree with Ken. Adria was strange and a little creepy. Keeping an eye on her would be a little like keeping an eye on a bit of quicksilver or a shooting star. When she had eaten all she wanted, she went upstairs and dutifully made her bed, a rather difficult task, considering its size, and then began to unpack and hang up her dresses in a big wooden wardrobe that served for a closet. Once or twice she went to the window and looked out at the tremendous view. The Pasha's house was set well up a steep hill, much higher than the line of fortress walls and towers below that made up Rumeli Hisar. She could see the high gray stone wall of the fortress, crenellated along the top in castle fashion. At each corner of this rear wall rose a large round tower, much like a castle in itself. But the wall was too high to see what lay beyond, and she turned her attention to the wide blue Bosporus, where numerous ships and small boats were visible this morning. The sight of the fortress had reminded her of something, and when she tired of watching the view, she took out a big folder she had packed into the bottom of her suitcase. The bed made a good place to lay out her castle collection. In spite of Aunt Laura's objections, she had brought the pictures with her. So far, she had 42 views of castles from all over the world. There were several from Scotland, Dunvegan Castle on the Isle of Skye, and Edinburgh Castle among them, and of course Windsor Castle from England. Niji Castle was in Kyoto, Japan, and there were castles from the Rhine country in Austria and the castle of Chillon in Switzerland. A picture of Rumeli Hisar would make an important addition, and it would have the further advantage of being the first real castle she had ever seen in person. She must remember to ask about getting inside it later. Adria had spoken of her gypsy friends spending a night there, but that wasn't Vicky's ambition. As she moved about the room, her foot struck the blue beads Adria had given her last night. She picked them up and examined them by daylight. They were a lovely blue in color, each one about as large as the end joint of her little finger. They seemed to be made of opaque colored glass, and sunlight glanced off them and made them shine. In one respect, they were disappointing. Could not be worn because there was no clasp. The strand was joined together by a long decorative bead through which the green cord on which they were strung was joined. It was knotted in a finial bead at the end. The string wasn't long enough to slip over her head, and she wondered what the beads were used for. Besides keeping off the evil eye, she thought, making a little face as she remembered Adria's nonsense. Before long, she'd had enough of unpacking and being indoors. She opened a French window and went out on the veranda. The tawny cat she had seen last night lay asleep in the sun. At her step, it opened its eyes and stared at her with the slitted yellow gaze of a tiger. It was the look of an owner regarding a trespasser, and Vicky left the cat alone. Through high carved arches that framed the long balcony, she could look down onto the garage and driveway and toward part of what seemed to be an enormous garden. Beyond the stone wall around the property, glimpsed here and there through foliage, she could see occasional white houses, some with red-tiled roofs, dotting the slopes of a cleft between hills that ran down toward the Bosporus. Above, the hills were gently rounded, thick with pine woods and dark strands of cypress. There was room to spread out in this country along the Bosporus, with none of the crowding that existed in Istanbul. Most of what had once been a pasha's garden was out of sight around the house, and from that direction she heard thin, high strains of music, as if someone was blowing into an instrument. She decided to go downstairs and investigate the sounds. Tiptoeing past the door of Adria's room, not wanting to be heard and summoned inside, she hurried downstairs. Following the lower hallway along the route she had taken last night, she found her way outdoors. Morning was warm and beautiful. She hardly needed the sweater she had flung about her shoulders. She could no longer hear the piping of music, but a frog orchestra had taken over and was tuning up noisily. The garden was so large that much of it was no longer tended and grew pleasantly wild, so that before long she was almost lost in shrubbery and weedy growth. Idly, she followed a path that led past a tiled fountain where water played. Beside it grew a tree completely afrothed with purplish-pink blossoms. She wandered past a wisteria arbor, dripping lavender flowers, and through a thick grove that seemed like a bit of forest. Here she turned and stood looking back at the long box of a house in the bright morning light. Beyond the unused portion of the veranda, the haremlik was shut behind the lattices of many shutters, empty now of all the bustle of color and life that must once have existed there. Having no idea from what direction the piping sounds of music had come, she was content to wander without purpose. Along the far boundary of the garden stretched a stone wall higher than her head, but before she reached it, a sunny little glen caught her eye. Small fig trees with twisted branches arched above it, and low shrubbery shut it in, though the grass was green inside where a patch of sunlight fell through. It was almost like a secret cave, half hidden by trees and brush, though open to the sky. As she stopped to enter the little clearing, a voice stopped her. "Don't go in there," it called sharply. Vicky turned to find Adria behind her, as if she had sprung out of the ground. There were two things to be considered about this daytime Adria. Chapitre. She was supposed to be in bed with a cold. Instead, she was up and dressed in a white frock that flounced with stiff crinoline under petticoats. Her hair was loose and neatly combed, and this time a rose-colored band of velvet held it back. Her slippers were white and spotless. Altogether, Adria, at 11 o'clock in the morning, was not in bed but dressed up as if for a very special party. Vicky said the only thing that occurred to her. "Mrs. Byrne said you were to stay in bed today." Adria laughed. "Mrs. Byrne is an old silly. I haven't any cold, but I might as well take advantage of staying home from school today." "Are you going to a party?" Vicky asked. "Party? Oh, you mean because of my dress? No, but I'm expecting company, and I feel partyish, so why shouldn't I dress up?" Vicky gestured toward the sunny glen within the twisted barrier of trees. Why don't you want me to go in there? It's forbidden, Adria said solemnly. Then she laughed again at Vicky's expression. It's forbidden because I forbid it. If you go in there now, you'll spoil everything. I'm waiting for the light to be right, and I don't want anyone to move the branches around. Wait a little while and I'll show you. Vicky regarded her curiously. Made Adria so different from any girl she had ever known, she wondered. So annoying, yet so fascinating. Have you always lived in Turkey? She asked. Adria had turned to look for something in the grass behind her. She found it, pounced, and tucked it away beside a stone, answering over her shoulder. I was born in Ankara when my father was teaching painting there, but we moved to Istanbul a few years ago, and I like it better here. Mustafa Kemal, he was the first president, built up Ankara as the capital, so that it's modern and beautiful, but I like Istanbul best. Would you like me to play for you? She had picked up a long instrument that Vicky recognized since she had seen recorders at home. Adria waited for no invitation, but flounced out her skirts and sat on a flat-topped boulder. She put the recorder to her lips and began to blow. With a few bars, Vicky recognized the tune. It was Little Buttercup from HMS Pinafore, and she smiled in recognition. Adria played it quite well, and Vicky sat down on the grass to tap time. Since Adria was apparently not going to mention the matter she had brought up last night about school, Vicky was glad to have someone for company. That was fine, she said when Adria knew the last note and laid the recorder down on the grass beside her. The music club girls from the Orta Okul are going to give some excerpts from Pinafore, and I'm in the orchestra, she said. Orta Oku? Vicky repeated. Yes, that's our prep school. Orta means middle. It's like a secondary in the States. School was not Vicky's favorite subject, and she asked no further questions. I was playing my recorder when I got rained on and was supposed to have caught my death of cold. I was here in the garden practicing when it started to rain. The rain sounds were wonderful, and I was trying to imitate them when Mrs. Byrne started shouting for me. I was so interested that I didn't notice how badly soaked I was. She broke off and dropped to her hands and knees, creeping toward the sunlit glen without much care for her white dress. In the bright light of morning, Vicky saw that her eyes looked not sea-gray as they had last night, but sea-green, and they were alight with a strange eagerness. When she reached the patch of sunlight, she studied it thoughtfully for a moment, and then looked around at Vicky. I do believe I'm right, she whispered. I believe the shape is what I thought it was. Come here and look. Tell me what you see. Interested, Vicky knelt beside Adria and stared through the tangle of shrubbery to the space of sunlight that marked the ground within the glen. What do you mean? She said. There's a spot of sunlight on the ground and shadow all around. So what? Shh, Adria said, as if the sun patch might hear her and vanish. What is it shaped like? Tell me. Vicky regarded the spot critically. Well, it's curved, sort of live, maybe like a yellow banana. Banana, Adria cried in disgust. Isn't it like a curved horn? A golden horn, perhaps? Or perhaps like... She broke off and ran back to the rock where she had left her recorder and reached into a hollow of earth beside it. With something in her hand, she returned to kneel beside Vicky. Like this, she finished and opened her fingers. In surprise and dismay, Vicky stared at the small jeweled object Adria held out to her. It was the little golden horn from Mrs. Byrne's precious collection. 5 over the wall, Vicky was shocked into silence. She stared at the pin in growing horror. Adria seemed not to notice her dismay. Don't you think the shape of that sunny patch in there is a little like the curve of this horn? Like the curve of Istanbul's golden horn? It looks like a banana to me, Vicky said flatly, and you'd better put that back right away before Mrs. Byrne finds out that it's missing. Oh, I'll put it back, Adria said airily. I've only borrowed it for a little while. But why? What if a sun patch does look a horn or a banana? What's the difference? Adria's sea-green eyes had a dreamy look. I don't know exactly, but I know there's something I must find. And when I find it, no, I won't tell you. You don't know anything about Turkey, and you don't believe in spells. Several remarks went through Vicky's mind, such as, of course I don't, or don't be silly, but she spoke none of them. There was something about Adria's faraway look that kept her from making fun. For an instant, it seemed as though Adria's eyes had turned gray again and were brimming with tears. Then she jumped up with a whirl of white skirts and ran back to her rock, where she tucked the jeweled pin into its hollow of grass and picked up the recorder. This time she paid no attention to Vicky when she put it to her lips, and the notes that floated out upon the air were melancholy and haunting. As she played, Vicky recognized the same sorrowful tune she had heard a woman singing off on the hillside last night. She was about to say so, but Adria looked at her intently and blinked her eyes without faltering in her playing. It was, Vicky recognized, a signal for silence. A strange thing was happening. From behind the high stone wall that marked the edge of the garden came a voice singing as it had sung the night before, blending in with the mournful tune of the recorder. Adria played through to the last wailing note, and the human voice followed. Then she jumped to her feet and ran toward the wall. "It's Layla," she cried. "I knew the gypsies had come when I heard her singing last night. I knew she'd be here today." Following more slowly, Vicky heard someone scrambling up the wall from the other side. A moment later, a girl's head appeared above it, a head with thick, tousled black hair through which strings of colored beads had been threaded. The brown-skinned, animated face that looked down at them was very pretty, as the girl smiled a greeting for Adria. She called out something Vicky did not understand and pulled herself up so that she could sit on top of the wall. She was probably 18 or 19, Vicky decided. She wore a rumpled white blouse with full, loose sleeves and a wide red cotton skirt flowered with splashes of yellow. About her neck hung numerous strands of bright beads, and gold hoops were fastened in her pierced earlobes. From beyond the wall, a child's voice called, and she reached a hand down to help someone else up the wall. A moment later, the scrawny figure of a little girl appeared beside her. The child was about 7 and seemed to be dressed in odds and ends of clothing given her by people who were older and larger. Her small, impish face was grimy, and her hair, with its narrow bandeau of blue beads, looked as though it had not lately seen a comb. "You've come, Layla. You found me," Adria cried. "I knew you would." "We find okay," said the older girl and looked questioningly at Vicky. Adria drew her forward. "This is my friend, Victoria. Victoria, this is Layla and her sister Samil." "Allo," said Layla and prodded the child beside her. "You tell Allo, Samil." Samil tried to hide behind her mat of hair but managed an echo of her sister's greeting. Vicky said, "Hello," and waited with interest to see what would happen next. The thought crossed her mind that Mrs. Byrne might not approve of gypsies, but she dismissed it at once. "I invite you to come in," Adria said, waving a hospitable hand toward the garden. The gypsy girl did not hesitate. She took the hand of her little sister, and they jumped down into the garden. Then she touched Adria's fair head with a light caress. Vicky sensed that it was as if the gypsy had told Adria that she knew of her parents' death, and that she grieved for her out of her own heart. Adria gave her a misty smile and murmured something in Turkish. Then she gestured toward the sunny glen. "Layla, I've found something. Come and see." Layla took her time. She looked around the overgrown garden and stared at the big silver-gray house that had once belonged to a pasha. Only the tiled roof and a few upstairs windows were visible from this place, the rest hidden by the lush growth of the garden. "Is good," she said, and moved her hands in a wide, graceful arc. "Like a palace." "My cousin Janet rents it," Adria said. "I liked our little house in Bebek better." In response to Adria's directions, Layla dropped to her knees and peered into the clearing. She seemed to understand at once what Adria meant, for she turned her head this way and that, even looking at the sunny space upside down through the crook of one arm. Her eyes were a dance with laughter and gaiety now. "No, is not the same," she said at length. "Is not the golden horn." "Then maybe this is it," Adria said. She picked up the little pen she had hidden near the rock and held it out to Layla. Samil, who had been dancing around the garden in delight, came to see, and everyone stared at the jeweled horn on Adria's palm. Layla touched it respectfully with her finger. "Very pretty, but no, I do not think can be," but I do not, Adria sighed. "Then how am I to find the sign? How am I to know?" "You can know," Layla said gravely, When is right, you can know. Adria seemed momentarily disappointed, but she turned her attention to other matters. Did you bring them? She asked. Did you bring the things for the fortune-telling? Layla's laugh reminded Vicky of her singing. It was melodic, but with a melancholy note in it, as if the weight of many troubles lay upon Gypsy's shoulders even when a gypsy laughed out loud. I bring, she said, and dipped into a voluminous pocket in her flowered skirt. In a moment she had brought out a goatskin pouch closed with a drawstring. As she opened it, Shamil came to stand beside her sister, watching. Her bright, dark eyes were as eager as Layla's, but it was Adria she watched, rather than the ritual. In fact, Vicky realized the child was mimicking Adria, standing as she did, moving when she moved. Layla saw and shook her head reprovingly, but Adria only laughed. Samil wants to be an American, Adria said. She can copy me if she likes. Samil is gypsy, said her sister in a tone that settled matters, and Samil did no more copying. In uneasy fascination, Vicky watched Layla smooth a place in the earth and then pour out a handful of glass beads and flat dried beans from the pouch. These she threw upon the earth, scattering them. Frowning, she squatted before the array and studied it with great concentration. Apparently, she did not like what she saw, for she gathered everything up and cast the beans and beads again. Then in silence, without explaining anything, she picked them up, put them away in the pouch, and drew the string tight. Adria watched in disappointment. Was it such a bad fortune that you can't tell me about it? The gypsy girl shrugged and would not say. Moving unexpectedly toward Vicky, she caught her right hand and turned it palm up, bending the fingers back and forth as if to test their flexibility. Startled and more uneasy than ever, Vicky was tempted to snatch her hand away, but she did not quite dare. With a slender, slightly dirty finger, Layla traced the lines in her palm, her big, dark eyes alive with excitement. Is sign here also? Sing of golden horn. Adria moved closer, and as she held out her own right palm, Vicky bent her head to follow the pointing gypsy finger and saw that the same curving double lines that crossed her own palm seemed to mark Adria's hand as well. They were not very long or clear lines, but they were there. What does she mean? Vicky asked. What's she talking about? Adria spoke a few quick words of Turkish to the gypsy, but Layla only smiled and tossed her head. Her rapid answer was spoken in the same language. Adria interpreted as solemnly as though she believed every word. She says our fortunes are tied together. The beads and the beans she cast show that bad things are going to happen to us. But when we find the golden horn, everything will be fine. If we do not find it, she snapped her fingers, disaster. But this she does not understand. She doesn't know whom it threatens. Adria moved closer to Vicky as if for reassurance. Victoria, I think I'm afraid. Vicky did not like the sound of any of this. So it is some sort of golden horn we must find, Adria went on. Layla says you're in great trouble too, and there will be worse to come. But she doesn't know, or at least she won't tell me any clues as to where to look for the thing that will help us. Vicky was glad when Layla let her hand go. She believed none of this, and she liked it less and less. How could Layla know about what trouble she was in? Or whether it would get better or worse? Though it was an easy guess that Vicky's particular troubles were likely to get a lot worse. A trilling whistle like a bird call sounded from beyond the stone wall, and Adria forgot the fortune-telling. It's your uncle, isn't it, Layla? Come up the wall with us, Victoria. Layla called to Samil, but the child had disappeared, so she climbed the wall nimbly without waiting. She reached down and pulled Adria to the top beside her, then held out a hand to Vicky. Curious to see Layla's uncle and know what lay beyond the wall, Vicky took her hand, found toe holds in the rough stone, and went easily up beside the other two. In the grass beyond the wall, a surprising sight awaited her. A large brown bear lay dozing upon the ground. Beside the bear stood a swarthy-skinned, black-mustached man in shabby black trousers, gray shirt, and a loose black vest. In one hand he held the end of a double chain attached to the bear's muzzle and to its red leather collar. At the sight of the three girls looking down at him from the wall, the gypsy flashed a broad smile, made them a ceremonious bow, and with a flourish caught up a tambourine from the ground. When he tugged at the bear's chain, the animal lumbered to its feet, Its master thumped the tambourine and chanted a song, while the bear waved its paws vaguely, moving from side to side on its hind legs in a dance without gaiety. Vicky felt sorry for the bear. His coat looked rough and scraggly, and he did not seem to be enjoying his work. The others appeared to take the whole thing for granted, and when Adria untied a few coins from a knot in her handkerchief and dropped them into the man's palm, Vicky looked away from the bear. Up here on the wall, she could see something of the countryside beyond the house grounds. The hill road curved past the garden and ran out of sight around a clump of trees higher up. Across the road was another stone wall, a very long one, marking private property. Close at hand beside the road grazed a donkey with pannier baskets across its back, and she wondered if Layla and Samil traveled by this means. Layla called for her sister again, and when the child came into view, she cried out in anger. Vicky and Adria looked down at once to see that Samil, her eyes mischievously alight, was dancing toward them through the garden. Her odd assortment of clothes made her look like a tiny scarecrow, but her slender arms were completely filled with flowers. She had broken off a branch from the pink flowering tree. She had pulled down a spray of wisteria, and a mass of yellow tulips finished off her huge bouquet. Layla cried out in Turkish and dropped into the garden from the wall. Before Chamil could move, she had boxed the child's ears and shaken her, scolding all the while. Samil began to cry, screwing up her small face and wailing out loud. Now it was Adria's turn to be indignant. She scrambled down the wall and ran to put her arms about Samil and hold her away from her sister. "Don't punish her," Adria cried. "It doesn't matter if she picked the flowers. Let her have them. There are plenty more where they came from." Samil smiled through her tears and leaned close to Adria, looking up at her gratefully. "I beat him good," Layla said, mixing up her pronouns in her anger over Samil's violation of hospitality. "No, you won't," said Adria, and Vicky admired her for taking the gypsy child's part. Samil looked thin and not very strong, as though the hard life of a wanderer might not agree with her. Vicky was about to climb down from the wall herself when a new voice made itself heard. "Adria? Vicky? Girls, where are you?" Oh dear, Vicky thought. Layla's prophecy of trouble was going to come true even more quickly than expected. Through the trees, she could glimpse Mrs. Burns' blue dress as she approached this outlying part of the garden. "Here we are," Adria answered. "We're over by the wall, Cousin Janet." To Vicky's surprise, she sounded perfectly calm and undisturbed. When Mrs. Byrne reached them, she was far from calm. Her attention focused first on Adria. "What are you doing out here when you're supposed to be in bed? And all dressed up like that as well?" At the first sound of her voice, Chamil had scampered behind a tree without dropping her burden of flowers. But Layla stayed where she was, and Mrs. Byrne gestured toward her. "What is that gypsy doing here?" she demanded of Adria. "Layla is my friend," Adria said calmly. "Every spring the gypsies come down from the hills to sell lavender. My mother always bought from Layla, and she hopes you will too." "I might buy if she comes to the door properly," Mrs. Byrne said. "But not if she sneaks into the gardens behind my back. Tell her to go around to the door." "She came into the garden because I invited her," Adria said with dignity. "And she understands what you are saying. She speaks a little English." Layla called to her sister sharply, and Chamil sidled out from her hiding place. With one look at Mrs. Burns' shocked expression, she dropped her armful of flowers, scuttled for the wall, and went up it like some small, terrified animal. Watching her, Mrs. Burns saw Vicky, still balanced on the broad top of the wall. She stared for a moment and then turned despairingly toward the scattered flowers. "This is too much," she said. "Come into the house at once, girls." With a long sigh over the flowers, she walked away through the trees without waiting to see if she was obeyed. Before Samil left her perch to follow her sister, she stuck out her tongue and made a face at Mrs. Burns' retreating back. Adria knelt and picked up the tulips. "They'll be all right in water," she said, "but the wisteria and the flowers from the Judas tree are crushed." Vicky could only marvel at her calm. "I expect we're in for it now. We'd better go back to the house right away." They walked through the garden together, but Adria did not hurry. "She's furious, isn't she?" Adria said, sounding pleased. but I won't let anyone be rude to Layla. My father liked gypsies. He used to paint them sometimes. Once he did a very good sketch of Layla and gave it to her. These Romany people are my friends." Mrs. Byrne had paused near the rear steps to wait for them, and she heard Adria's words. "Gypsies are not to be trusted," she told her. "You can never tell what a gypsy will do. I don't want them on my property, Adria. Please understand that. The child was too young to know better about the flowers, but one of you could have stopped her. I must say I'm disappointed in you, Vicky. I'd hoped you would keep Adria entertained and in bed. She's home from school today for the sake of her health, you know." Vicky couldn't see how she could have done anything to keep Adria in bed, especially since the other girl was already up and out of the house ahead of her, but she made no attempt to explain these things to Mrs. Byrne. Adria's cousin Janet was too annoyed to be argued with. "I'll go look at the gypsies' lavender and get rid of them," Mrs. Byrne said as they went into the house. "But Adria, please don't ask them onto our property again. I don't want to quarrel with anything your father and mother did, but you are living with me now." "Yes, Cousin Janet," Adria said more meekly than Vicky would have expected. "May I stay up if I change my dress? I don't really have a cold." Mrs. Byrne paused in the hallway of the house to put a hand on Adria's forehead. "If you're sure you're all right, I suppose you can go back to school this afternoon. Do try to keep out of trouble until then, both of you." She left them near the foot of the stairs, and Adria grinned at Vicky. "My, but you look mad. I'll give these tulips to Fatma to put in water. Then let's go up to your room and I'll tell you about Layla and Camille. They're only half gypsy. It's a very romantic story." Vicky was not sure if she was more indignant with Mrs. Byrne for her injustice or Arya for getting her involved in this escapade. She did know that she wanted no more trouble, so decidedly not of her own making. When Adria returned to the kitchen, she put her main worry into words. "Did you bring the pin back from the garden?" she asked. Adria tossed her head, and the soft blonde hair floated about her shoulders at the movement. "Of course not. Do you think I want to be caught? I hid it in the hollow beside the big rock. I'll return it when it's safe." "Remember that I had nothing to do with your taking that pin," Vicky said. Adria surprised her with a sudden winning smile. "I'll take the blame if anything goes wrong. Come along to your room and I'll tell you about Layla." Somewhat reluctantly, Vicky followed her upstairs. She could only hope that Mrs. Byrne would not decide to show the new piece in her collection to someone before Adria put it back. 6. The trouble begins. Sheltered as it was by closed shutters, Vicky's big bedroom was almost as cool as it had been the night before. But Adria flew about, opening the veranda doors, pushing the shutters ajar, flinging wide the window from which the Bosporus could be seen. "I love sunlight. I love to be warm," she cried. "This is a beautiful room. I wish it were mine. It was good of your dad to give it up so that you could have it." Vicky stared in surprise. "You mean this was my father's room before I came? Didn't Cousin Janet tell you? He thought the view might make up for the way you'd feel when you first arrived. He said he didn't mind taking a smaller room. He could work anywhere. Not that there's what you'd call a small room in the entire house. Hey, what's this?" Adria, moving about in her quicksilver way, had reached the bed where Vicky had left the collection of castle pictures spread out in rows across the coverlet. She was not sure she wanted Adria to see the pictures, but it was already too late. "These are wonderful," Adria said, and picked up first one and then another. "What fun you must have with them. This castle with the stairway going up into a tower, for instance. The picture is so clear you can almost climb the steps and look into the room above." Vicky was pleased. She had never known exactly why she loved pictures of castles, but unlike Aunt Laura, it a good idea and walked right into the pictures as in person, if they themselves were as real as Vicky tried to imagine. "There are some wonderful old castles in Turkey," Adria said. "You must see Rumeli Hisar, but now let's talk about gypsies." She curled herself up in the room's one big armchair, and Vicky put some of the pictures aside and sat cross-legged on the bed, listening as Adria told her Layla's story. Her mother was a Turkish girl, a Gorgio, as the Romany people call non-gypsies. The family lives in Istanbul. Layla's grandfather is a retired army officer. He was terribly upset when his daughter fell in love with a gypsy and ran away with him. Layla and Shamile were born among gypsies and lived that way until their gypsy father died a few years ago. Their mother returned to her family in Istanbul and brought the two girls with her. She and Layla went to work as maids in an American household in Bebek, and they took little Shamile with them, as maids with children do when they go to work in Turkey. That's how it happens that she and Layla speak a little English. Then why did they go back to being gypsies? Their mother died too, and Layla couldn't wait to join the gypsy tribe again. Her grandparents wanted both girls to stay with them, but Layla is truly a gypsy. She doesn't want any other life. So she took Samil and went back to gypsy ways. My mother and father knew her when she worked as a maid for friends of ours. After she became a gypsy again, she used to drop in to see us whenever they came near Istanbul. That's why I knew she would go to the place where we used to live and ask questions about us. I knew she would find me. If she hadn't, I'd have left word sometime with her Gorgio family in Istanbul. I know where they live. I visited them once with my mother and father. The faraway look was in Adria's eyes again, as though she was remembering happier times. "Isn't it strange," Vicky said, "that your mother and mine were good friends when they were our age? Did you know that?" Adria nodded. "Your father told me. That's one reason I was anxious for you to come." Vicky felt unaccountably touched. It was hard to be annoyed with Adria for long. "Why don't you explain about Layla to Mrs. Byrne?" she asked gently. "Tell her what you've told me." "She wouldn't understand," Adria said. "All she thinks about is getting home to America. She doesn't like Turkey or any of the other places she has lived. My father used to say that there are some Americans who never fit into life in a foreign country, want everything to be the way it was at home. Of course, it never is, so they're critical and dissatisfied. Mrs. Byrne is counting the days until she can leave, about 6 months from now." "What about you?" Vicky asked. "Will you be going home with the Byrnes?" The flash in Adria's eyes was sudden green lightning. "Turkey is my home. I don't know anything about America except from books and from what people say. Maybe I'm like Layla is in wanting to be a gypsy. I want to stay here. But I don't have any other relatives except Uncle Hinton, whom I can't stand. He's my mother's older brother, but he was never very nice to us. Besides, he travels all the time and doesn't live in one place." Adria left her chair and crossed the big room to the bed. Before Vicky knew what she intended, Adria caught her right hand and turned it palm up as Layla had done. Beside it, she set her own smaller hand and stared earnestly at the two palms. "We'll find it together," Adria said. "Whether you like it or not, we're tied together in the search for a golden horn." Vicky drew her hand away uncomfortably. "What do you think would happen if you found whatever it is?" "I don't know," Adria said. "Last year, when Layla came to see us in Bebek, she pointed out the mark in my hand. She said the dreadful things would stop happening when I found what I must search for. How could she know what was going to happen when it hadn't even started then, unless she has second sight? They say some gypsies do have it, you know. Now you're in it too, and you've got to help me look for it. You've got to help me look for it." Vicky had heard enough of such notions for one day. I'm not going to for something when I don't know where to start or what it is, and when I don't believe in it in the first place. She slid off the bed to end matters. "I think I'll go wash up for lunch. I'm dirty from climbing that wall." Adria stared at her for a moment, her eyes unreadable. Then she dashed for the door ahead of Vicky. Beyond the big salon, the door of Adria's room banged shut, and Vicky knew that the other girl was offended. She couldn't help that. Adria's problems were real enough, but she couldn't work them out with gypsy spells. The sooner she came to her senses, the better. At lunch, Mrs. Byrne still seemed annoyed, and Adria was lost in her own silence. So, Vicky ate more or less in silence too, answering Mrs. Byrne when she was spoken to, but making no remarks of her own. As before, the food was delicious, and she enjoyed the white Turkish cheese and red tomatoes. Conversation did not seem necessary. Right after lunch, Adria went down to the waterfront to take a bus the short distance to school. Mrs. Byrne said she was going upstairs for a nap, and Vicky found herself with a long, empty afternoon stretching ahead of her. Mrs. Byrne had said she might follow the road for a little way, either up or down the hill. She couldn't get lost on it. So, when she was alone, Vicky started out in the bright spring sunshine, choosing the downhill course. The road was narrow and paved in asphalt, where it dipped steeply toward the walls and towers of the fortress as she followed it. Vicky thought of her strange morning and of all the disturbing things that had happened. She thought of Adria and the troubles she seemed to be creating for herself, and she came to a conclusion. Having made up her mind, she felt better. There was one thing she might do to help, whether Adria approved of it or not. Now, she could take real pleasure in her walk of exploration. The road changed to cobblestones and separated in a Y where it ran behind a fortress. She chose the right-hand turn, then followed it toward the water. The castle walls and great round towers were impressive close up, but she did not want to attempt a castle visit now. The waterfront road was busy with traffic. Diesel engine buses and trucks, smoking blackly, ran noisily up and down the narrow way. Beyond, the waters of the Bosporus lapped only a little way below the edge of the land. Fishing boats with curved prows, their interiors brightly painted, were drawn to the shore, and great fishing nets dyed green and brown and bright blue were spread out to dry. Across the water on the Anatolia side, a white palace shone in the sun, and there were domed mosques here and there with their adjacent minarets. Up the hills behind the villages on the other side, the pink blossoms of Judas trees spread delicate color. She did not want to walk too far this first time, and before long she turned uphill again toward home. As she climbed, she began to make up a letter to her mother in her mind. She would write it today and send it off airmail. She would tell her mother about Adria, whose mother had been her friend when she was a young girl, and about the gypsies, Layla and Semil, but not about how angry Mrs. Byrne had been or about the little sword pin Adria had taken from her cousin Janet's collection. There would be no need to mention that because it would no longer be a problem. She was going to do something about it herself. And right away. The house was quiet when she let herself in the front gate. Walking quietly around to follow the paths of the garden, she passed the fountain, the flowering Judas tree, the wisteria arbor, and soon she was again in the wild part of the old garden. Here, under the plane trees, it was shady and cool, and she found her way to the little glen where a streak of sunlight had so interested Adria that morning. Now, the shadows had changed, and the sun was gone from the encircled patch of grass. Without difficulty, she found the rock where Adria had sat and put her hand into the hollow beside it. There was nothing there. She got down on her hands and knees and carefully separated the stalks of grass and weeds, searching through them with her fingers. But though she searched persistently all the way around the rock, she found no jeweled pin. When she was sure that her search had been thorough, she sat down on the rock to think. This was a foolish place to hide such a tiny object. In her hurry, Adria could have let it slip out of her fingers anywhere, so that it might never come to light again. A careless foot might press it into the earth. Adria's recorder lay in plain sight on the ground where she had forgotten it, but no amount of looking brought the pin to light. It was possible, of course, that Adria had slipped out here alone, retrieved the pin, and put it back in its place. She could move like the wind, or as secretly as a little ghost, so she could have managed this sleight of hand right under Mrs. Byrne's nose. Surely that was what must have happened. But Vicky knew she would not feel comfortable until she made sure. She picked up the recorder and went back toward the house. Everything was quiet, sleeping. As before, all the veranda windows in the closed-off harem part of the house were shut and had a deserted look about them. How queer it was to live in a house where numerous rooms were closed off completely so that no one ever went into them. Sometimes she would like to see that part of the house, but not now. There was something else she must do. Quietly, she let herself in and tiptoed through the narrow hall to the place where it opened out into the great, cool lower hall at the foot of the stairs. It was off this that Mrs. Byrne's Turkish sitting room opened. There were several doors, however, and the first one she tried was the wrong door. The next was right, and she pulled it open upon shuttered darkness. A little nervously, she sought for a light switch and turned on the overhead chandelier. She would not go in, of course. She would stand here in the doorway and look. If Adria had returned the horn, then she ought to see it quickly enough. But the problem was more difficult than she had expected. Mrs. Burns' collection was rich in so many objects of varied size. Now that she could view the big cabinet in the corner, she was no longer sure exactly which place the pin had occupied. There was a little space between an ivory elephant and a Satsuma bowl. Was that where it had been? Or had it been on the shelf above, where small lacquer boxes showed a gap? As far as Vicky could tell, no gleaming golden horn lay among the other objects. Still, she could not be sure from here, since it wasn't very large and she wanted to be positive. She went into the room, still on tiptoe, breathing quickly now and moving with a sense of imminent danger. She did not know the ways of this household, and at any moment she might be discovered. Yet the objects on the shelves drew her. The glass reflected electric light confusingly, so she opened the cabinet door and stood looking carefully at the collection. How fascinating these things were. A tiny Japanese lady carved in ivory walked pigeon-toed with an ivory umbrella held over her head. Vicky put her hands behind her back, lest she be tempted to touch, to pick up. She wasn't here to admire the collection, but to locate one special object. The voice behind her came without warning. In a way, she was not surprised. Discovery seemed part of the pattern of bad luck that dogged her steps. "What are you doing here, Vicky?" Mrs. Byrne asked. Her tone was quiet, but that fact was not reassuring. Vicky sensed that Mrs. Byrne was holding herself in check. She turned about, frying desperately to think of something to say. She could feel her face burning in a betrayal of guilt when there was nothing to betray. "Well," Mrs. Byrne said curtly. I was just looking," Vicky stammered. "Your collection is so interesting." "I believe I offered to show it to you myself," Mrs. Byrne said, "and I'm sure I told you that this room is private." Vicky said nothing at all. When Mrs. Byrne walked to the cabinet, straightened a small bowl, and closed the door, she held her breath. At any moment she might look toward the place where the horn should be and discover that it was missing. "I can't wait to get these things home," Mrs. Byrne said. "I only hope I can manage without having anything broken or stolen." Vicky found herself wondering how Ken's mother could show such enthusiasm about collecting the artwork of foreign countries without liking the countries or the people in them. It was a relief when she stopped touching and straightening and led the way out of the room, closing the door behind her. Her evidence of displeasure was clear. It won't be long now before everyone comes home from school. "Do you suppose you can amuse yourself without getting into trouble until that time?" she asked. Vicky nodded silently and went upstairs to her room. She felt cross again and unjustly treated, but at the same time almost limp with relief because nothing more serious had happened. If Mrs. Byrne only knew it, she was the one who had been trying to protect the collection. But she could not explain without betraying Adria, and she had no wish to do that. As she went upstairs, she decided that Adria must have brought the pin from the garden and hidden it in her own room to wait for an opportune moment for returning it. She could only hope again that Adria would put it back before Mrs. Byrne found out it was gone. In her bedroom, Vicky sat down at a small table to write the letter to her mother. The words would not come as easily now as they had earlier in her mind, and before long she gave up. She read for a while, but her thoughts kept wandering from her book.